The cigar sits untouched in the crystal ashtray, smoke curling upward in the humid Havana afternoon. Fidel Castro reaches for it, his fingers inches from the perfectly rolled tobacco that took a team of CIA technicians 3 weeks to prepare. Inside the wrapper, hidden within layers of carefully treated leaf, a compound waits. Botulinum toxin concentrated enough to kill a man within hours of exposure to his lips. The agent who placed it there, a kitchen worker recruited 6 months earlier for exactly this moment, watches from across the room, his pulse hammering in his ears. Castro's hand hovers over the cigar, then moves past it, selecting instead a different one from the wooden box beside it. The poisoned cigar remains in the ashtray, undisturbed, just another failure in what would become the longest, most obsessive, and most unsuccessful assassination campaign in modern intelligence history. The year was 1960, and the world balanced on the edge of nuclear annihilation. Fidel Castro had seized power in Cuba just a year earlier, overthrowing the American-backed dictator, Fulgencio Batista, in a revolution that promised land reform, education, and liberation from foreign exploitation. What began as a nationalist uprising had rapidly evolved into something that terrified Washington, a communist foothold 90 miles from American shores, an ally of the Soviet Union positioned close enough to threaten the entire Western Hemisphere. President Dwight Eisenhower, nearing the end of his administration, authorized the CIA to develop options for removing Castro from power. The directive was intentionally vague, couched in bureaucratic language about destabilization and regime change, but everyone in the room understood what was being requested. Find a way to eliminate Fidel Castro permanently. Richard Bissell, the CIA's deputy director for plans, received the assignment with the understanding that failure was not acceptable. Bissell had orchestrated the U-2 spy plane program and managed covert operations across Latin America, earning a reputation as the agency's most creative and ruthless strategist. He assembled a team within the CIA's Technical Services Division, engineers, chemists, physicians, and psychological warfare specialists, tasked with developing methods to kill a foreign leader without leaving American fingerprints. The team worked from a secure facility in Virginia, their existence unknown even to most CIA personnel, exploring possibilities that ranged from conventional shooting to chemical poisoning, to elaborate schemes that sounded like they belonged in spy novels, rather than serious intelligence planning. Their mandate was unlimited creativity, constrained only by the requirement of deniability. The challenge they faced was substantial. Castro was not a typical target who followed predictable routines or relied on limited security. He moved constantly, changed locations without pattern, varied his schedule deliberately to prevent surveillance from establishing usable intelligence. His security detail, trained by Soviet advisors, employed counter-surveillance techniques that made tracking his movements nearly impossible. He ate from communal kitchens where dozens of people handled food, making targeted poisoning difficult. He wore a beard that had become his trademark, making disguise ineffective for anyone attempting to approach him. And he possessed what seemed like supernatural luck, an uncanny instinct for danger that led him to change plans at the last moment, avoid situations that felt wrong, and survive circumstances that should have killed him. The first serious attempt came in August 1960 during preparations for what would become the Bay of Pigs invasion. The CIA identified a contact within the Cuban government, an official who had access to Castro's living quarters, and expressed willingness to assist for ideological and financial reasons. The Technical Services Division developed a poison specifically for the operation, a compound derived from shellfish toxin that would cause paralysis and respiratory failure within minutes of ingestion. The poison was tasteless, odorless, and would metabolize quickly, leaving minimal trace evidence that might indicate assassination rather than natural causes. The plan called for the contact to place the poison in Castro's coffee during a meeting at the presidential palace, then create confusion by triggering a fire alarm, allowing time to escape before security could identify the perpetrator. The contact received the poison in a container disguised as a pill bottle, along with detailed instructions for deployment and exfiltration. He carried it into the presidential palace on August 15, 1960, during a meeting of government officials discussing sugar production quotas. Castro sat at the head of a long mahogany table, coffee cup within arm's reach, surrounded by ministers and military advisors debating export contracts. The contact waited for the right moment, when attention focused on charts and documents, when he could move naturally without drawing scrutiny. But as he reached into his pocket, his hand trembling slightly from adrenaline, he felt the container's cap had loosened. The poison had leaked, saturating his pocket, absorbing into the fabric of his suit. He froze, realizing that touching it now would contaminate his fingers, potentially killing him instead of his target. The meeting continued for 2 hours, while he sat immobilized by fear, the poison soaking through his clothing, the opportunity evaporating. Castro left alive, unaware how close death had been. The failure prompted recalibration. If placing poison directly in Castro's food or drink proved too difficult, perhaps the poison could be delivered through objects he touched regularly. The Technical Services Division developed a series of contaminated items: a fountain pen whose tip contained concentrated poison that would absorb through skin contact, a diving suit treated with tubercle bacilli and a fungus that would cause chronic disease, and most infamously, a box of Castro's favorite cigars treated with botulinum toxin. The cigars were perfect replicas, hand-rolled by Cuban expatriates in Miami, who understood exactly how Castro preferred his tobacco. Each cigar contained enough toxin to kill within hours, but the delivery mechanism required subtlety. The cigars needed to reach Castro through channels that would not arouse suspicion, placed among his regular supply where he would select them naturally. The CIA recruited operatives within Cuba's cigar industry, workers who handled tobacco shipments destined for government offices and Castro's various residences. In November 1960, a shipment of premium cigars arrived at the presidential palace, processed through normal channels, inspected by security, and delivered to Castro's personal humidor. 5 of the cigars in that shipment were poisoned, indistinguishable from the others, except for microscopic contamination invisible without laboratory analysis. Castro smoked cigars constantly, often going through 5 or 6 per day during long meetings and public appearances. The odds seemed favorable that within days, perhaps hours, he would select one of the poisoned cigars and expose himself to the lethal dose carefully prepared in Virginia. Days passed, then weeks. Intelligence assets monitored Cuban radio for announcements of illness or emergency medical situations at the presidential palace. Nothing came. Either Castro had not smoked the poisoned cigars, or the toxin had degraded during shipping, or his security had somehow identified and removed them. The operation remained classified for decades, its failure unacknowledged. By early 1961, the CIA's frustration with conventional poisoning methods led to exploration of more theatrical approaches. If Castro could not be poisoned quietly, perhaps he could be eliminated publicly in a way that appeared accidental or attributable to Cuban dissidents rather than American intelligence. William Harvey, a legendary CIA officer known for his work on the Berlin Tunnel operation, took over management of the anti-Castro efforts, bringing a more aggressive operational philosophy. Harvey had no patience for subtle approaches that failed repeatedly. He wanted results, preferably spectacular ones, that would send a message beyond simply removing Castro from power. Under his direction, the Technical Services Division began developing what internal documents referred to as special devices, mechanisms designed to kill in ways that would seem too bizarre to attribute to a government agency. One proposal involved exploiting Castro's well-known love of scuba diving. Intelligence indicated he frequently dived along Cuba's northern coast, often with minimal security, enjoying the solitude underwater. The Technical Services Division proposed preparing a diving suit contaminated with Madura foot fungus and tubercle bacilli, which would cause debilitating illness upon prolonged skin contact. A separate plan involved placing an explosive device inside a colorful seashell positioned along Castro's known diving routes. The theory was that Castro, an enthusiastic collector of shells, would be attracted to an unusually spectacular specimen and pick it up, triggering the explosion. Both plans required detailed knowledge of Castro's diving habits, access to locations he frequented, and perfect timing. The contaminated wetsuit was actually prepared, treated in a laboratory, and delivered to a contact who was supposed to present it to Castro as a gift from an admirer. The contact lost his nerve, later reporting that security around Castro had intensified, making the approach impossible. The exploding seashell never progressed beyond prototype stage, abandoned when technical analysis suggested the device could not be made both attractive enough to catch Castro's attention and sufficiently powerful to ensure lethality. The failures accumulated with disturbing regularity, each one analyzed and debriefed, each one leading to new approaches that seemed more desperate than the last. The CIA tried developing a poisoned chocolate milkshake, knowing Castro frequented the Havana Libre Hotel's coffee shop, where he had a documented fondness for the drink. An operative worked at the shop for 3 months, waiting for the opportunity to add poison from a capsule hidden in the freezer. When the moment finally arrived, the capsule had frozen to the freezer coils and could not be retrieved without breaking it. The operative watched Castro drink an unpoisoned milkshake, sitting close enough to touch him, unable to act. They tried recruiting Castro's mistress, offering money and protection in exchange for placing poison in his sleeping quarters. She accepted the assignment, received the poison, and disappeared, either unable to follow through or having warned Castro of the plot. They attempted to contaminate his food supply at multiple residences simultaneously, coordinating with Cuban exile groups to place poison in storage facilities, only to discover that Castro's security had implemented random rotation of food sources, specifically to prevent such attacks. The obsession with eliminating Castro intensified after the Bay of Pigs disaster in April 1961. The CIA-backed invasion of Cuba by Cuban exiles failed catastrophically, with the invasion force defeated within 3 days and more than 1,000 men captured. President John F. Kennedy, humiliated by the failure, authorized expanded operations against Cuba under the codename Operation Mongoose. The program's stated objective was destabilizing the Castro regime through sabotage, propaganda, and support for internal resistance movements. But assassination remained a central, if officially unacknowledged, component. Robert Kennedy, the president's brother and attorney general, personally supervised Mongoose, attending weekly meetings where progress was reviewed and new operations approved. The pressure for results was immense. The Kennedy administration's credibility damaged by the Bay of Pigs, the Cold War competition with the Soviet Union intensifying, and Castro becoming increasingly entrenched and defiant. William Harvey, now running the CIA's Cuba operations with near-complete autonomy, decided that agency personnel alone could not accomplish the mission. What was needed was deniability and ruthlessness beyond what government employees could provide. he made a decision that would become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire assassination campaign. He reached out to organized crime. The logic was cynical, but operationally sound. The mafia had lost enormously when Castro nationalized Cuba's casinos and expelled American criminal enterprises from the island. They had motivation for revenge, resources to conduct operations without government oversight, and skills in violence that exceeded most intelligence operatives. Most importantly, if a mafia assassination attempt succeeded or failed, the U.S. government could claim complete ignorance, dismissing any connection as conspiracy theory. Harvey's intermediary was Robert Maheu, a former FBI agent who ran a private investigation firm and maintained contacts throughout both intelligence and criminal communities. In September 1960, before Harvey's direct involvement, but with CIA authorization, Maheu approached Johnny Roselli, a high-ranking member of the Chicago outfit, with extensive connections to Las Vegas and Hollywood. Roselli was sophisticated, educated, and understood operations requiring discretion and deniability. Maheu's pitch was straightforward. The U.S. government wanted Castro eliminated and was willing to pay $150,000 for success, with support provided in the form of equipment, intelligence, and protection from prosecution. Roselli, motivated partly by patriotism and partly by the mafia's losses in Cuba, agreed to participate and brought in Sam Giancana, the Chicago outfit's boss, and Santo Traficante Jr., who had run mafia operations in Cuba before the revolution and maintained contacts on the island. The partnership between America's premier intelligence agency and the nation's most powerful crime syndicate was surreal and deeply troubling. CIA officers met with mafia bosses in hotel rooms and restaurants, discussing murder techniques over cocktails, providing poison pills manufactured in government laboratories to men whose organizations were supposedly under FBI investigation. Giancana and Traficante brought operational capabilities the CIA lacked, contacts inside Cuba who could move freely without attracting security attention, experience in contract killing that exceeded anything in the agency's repertoire, and a willingness to employ violence without the bureaucratic constraints that limited government operations. In exchange, they received not only money, but also something more valuable: protection. The CIA intervened to limit FBI surveillance of Giancana, provided cover for mafia operations, and created a relationship that would later explode into public scandal. The mafia's first attempt came in early 1961. Traficante identified a contact in Havana, a Cuban with access to restaurants Castro frequented, and motivation rooted in personal grievance rather than politics. The CIA provided poison pills, small capsules containing botulinum toxin that would dissolve in liquid and kill within hours. The pills were delivered to Havana through a courier network that moved people and materials between Florida and Cuba, hidden among legitimate cargo, transferred through several hands before reaching the contact. The plan called for placing a pill in Castro's drink at a restaurant near the presidential palace, where he occasionally dined with advisors. The contact positioned himself in the restaurant, waiting through several evenings until Castro finally arrived, surrounded by security, but seated at a table where drinks could potentially be accessed. The contact approached the table, carrying a tray with glasses, the poison pill palmed in his hand. But as he neared, one of Castro's bodyguards stepped into his path, asking routine questions about the service, creating delay. The moment passed, Castro left, and the contact was left holding an unused poison pill that represented months of planning and coordination. Subsequent mafia attempts followed similar patterns of careful preparation, followed by operational failure. They tried recruiting Castro's personal chef, offering money that would set up his family for life in exchange for one successful poisoning. The chef accepted the money, agreed to the terms, and then apparently reconsidered, either from conscience or fear, vanishing without acting. They attempted to position a sniper at a rally where Castro was scheduled to speak, identifying a building with clear sightline to the podium, bribing security to allow access. The sniper, a Cuban exile with military training, took position hours before the rally, weapon assembled and loaded, waiting for Castro to appear. The rally was canceled at the last minute, Castro appearing instead at a different location across the city. His schedule changed without announcement. They proposed a bomb placed in a television camera, knowing Castro loved giving long interviews where he sat relatively stationary. The bomb was built, small enough to fit inside camera equipment, but powerful enough to kill everyone in the room. The television station's security discovered it during a routine equipment check, apparently by accident, leading to arrests of several operatives and collapse of the network that had taken months to establish. By 1962, the number of documented assassination attempts had reached double digits, with additional operations in various stages of planning or execution. The CIA kept meticulous records, filed in safes at headquarters, detailing each operation's methodology, operatives involved, resources expended, and reasons for failure. The files read like dark comedy, a catalog of increasingly bizarre schemes that shared only their common outcome. Castro remained alive. They tried giving him a cigar at a UN meeting in New York, hoping he would smoke it in a closed environment where the toxin would be most effective. He accepted the cigar, but gave it to an aide who kept it as a souvenir. They prepared a scuba diving suit as a gift, contaminated with fungus, planning to present it through a Canadian diplomat. The diplomat refused, unwilling to risk his career on such an obvious assassination attempt. They considered using Marita Lorenz, a German woman who had a romantic relationship with Castro, recruiting her to kill him with poison pills hidden in her cold cream jar. She agreed, traveled to Cuba, met with Castro in his hotel suite, and at the crucial moment, could not bring herself to act, later claiming he had suspected her purpose and dared her to proceed. The CIA's Technical Services Division became increasingly creative, developing weapons that seemed inspired by science fiction rather than intelligence tradecraft. They designed a poison-tipped pen that could be stabbed into Castro during a crowd event, delivering a lethal dose through what would appear to be an accidental collision. The pen was tested on animals, proved effective, and was delivered to an operative in Havana who never found an opportunity to get close enough to use it. They created a poisoned wetsuit that would be provided as a diplomatic gift, knowing Castro's diving hobby. The wetsuit was tailored to his measurements, carefully contaminated with bacteria and fungal spores, then delivered through a third party. Castro never wore it, either suspicious of unsolicited gifts or simply preferring his own equipment. They explored using depilatory chemicals in his shoes that would cause his iconic beard to fall out. Not lethal, but potentially damaging to his public image and authority. The operation was abandoned as insufficiently serious, though the chemicals were actually prepared and tested. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 added nuclear stakes to the assassination campaign. When American U-2 spy planes discovered Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba, the world came closer to nuclear war than at any point in the Cold War. President Kennedy imposed a naval blockade, demanded the missiles' removal, and prepared for possible military invasion. For 13 days, American and Soviet forces stood at the brink. Missiles armed, bombers in the air, submarines positioned for nuclear launch. The crisis resolved through diplomatic negotiation, the Soviets agreeing to remove the missiles in exchange for American pledges, not to invade Cuba, and secret agreement to remove American missiles from Turkey. But the crisis intensified the Kennedy administration's desire to eliminate Castro, viewing him as the catalyst for Soviet aggression in the Western Hemisphere. If Castro were removed, the logic went, Cuba might return to American influence, and Soviet presence in the Caribbean would end. Operation Mongoose expanded dramatically after the missile crisis, with budgets increased, personnel added, and operations accelerated. The CIA established a massive station in Miami, codenamed JM.Wave, that became the agency's largest facility outside headquarters. At its peak, JM.Wave employed over 300 CIA officers and several thousand Cuban exile operatives, running operations ranging from sabotage raids against Cuban infrastructure to propaganda campaigns to continued assassination plotting. The station occupied a former naval air facility with offices, training facilities, communications equipment, and boats for launching nighttime raids across the Florida Straits. The scale of operations was enormous, with hundreds of missions conducted annually, most focused on destabilizing the Cuban economy and military, but many specifically targeting Castro himself. The assassination attempts became almost routine, planned and executed with the same bureaucratic process as any other intelligence operation, briefed in meetings, documented in files, evaluated in after-action reports. If you're still here watching this incredible story of obsession and failure, if you're amazed that one man could survive hundreds of sophisticated attempts by the world's most powerful intelligence agency and organized crime working together, go ahead and like this video and comment the word survivor below. Let's see how many of us appreciate the sheer improbability of Castro's survival. The partnership with the Mafia continued through 1962 and into 1963, despite growing concerns within the CIA about the relationship's risks. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, initially unaware of the CIA Mafia connection, discovered it through surveillance of Giancana, and was furious that a criminal he considered a priority target was receiving CIA protection. Hoover demanded explanations, threatening to expose the operation unless properly briefed. The CIA reluctantly acknowledged the relationship, providing minimal details while insisting on continued operational necessity. Hoover, recognizing the political sensitivity, agreed not to prosecute, but insisted on being informed of all future contacts. The bureaucratic tension added another layer of complexity to operations already struggling with operational security, political oversight, and Castro's maddeningly effective security apparatus. In March 1963, the CIA tried a new approach, recruiting a Cuban military officer stationed at a base near Havana who claimed access to Castro during military briefings. The officer, codenamed A.M. Lash in CIA documents, was actually Rolando Cubela, a doctor who had participated in the revolution but become disillusioned with Castro's communist direction. Cubela met with CIA handlers in Brazil, explaining that he had opportunities to approach Castro during private meetings where security was relatively light. He asked for a weapon that would not be detected during security screening, something that appeared innocuous but could deliver a lethal strike at close range. The Technical Services Division developed several options, including a ballpoint pen rigged with a hypodermic needle containing poison. The pen looked completely normal, wrote normally, but with specific manipulation could inject enough poison to cause death within minutes. Cubela received the poison pen during a meeting with a CIA officer in Paris in November 1963. The officer, using the alias Carlos, explained the pen's mechanism, demonstrated its use, and provided a poison capsule to be inserted before deployment. Cubela expressed concern about being captured and tortured if the operation failed, requesting assurance of American support. The CIA officer offered vague promises of assistance while emphasizing that success would require Kubela to act independently, without visible American involvement. Kubela returned to Cuba with the poison pen, intending to approach Castro during an upcoming military meeting. On November 22, 1963, the same day Kubela received the poison pen in Paris, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. The coincidence would later fuel conspiracy theories connecting Castro, the CIA, and Kennedy's murder, though no credible evidence supported such connections. More immediately, Kennedy's death transformed the political context for anti-Castro operations. President Lyndon Johnson, who succeeded Kennedy, was less personally invested in eliminating Castro and more focused on Vietnam and domestic policy. Johnson continued supporting operations against Cuba, but with less intensity and direct oversight. The CIA's assassination efforts persisted, but with reduced resources and less political urgency. William Harvey had been removed from the Cuba account in 1963 after clashing with Robert Kennedy, replaced by officers who took more bureaucratic approaches. The mafia relationship gradually dissolved, Giancana and Trafficante losing interest as the promised payment never fully materialized, and FBI pressure on their organizations intensified. By 1964, the assassination campaign had lost momentum, continuing through inertia and bureaucratic habit, rather than strategic conviction. Yet attempts continued, driven partly by institutional momentum and partly by the CIA's genuine belief that Castro represented a fundamental threat to American interests. In 1964, operatives tried to recruit Castro's personal pilot, offering money and asylum in exchange for causing a fatal accident during a flight. The pilot refused immediately, either loyal to Castro or unwilling to risk his family's safety. They approached Castro's doctor, proposing to provide a lethal injection disguised as routine vaccination. The doctor never responded, cutting off all contact with the intermediary. They considered more elaborate schemes, contaminating Castro's food supply at multiple locations simultaneously, overwhelming security through sheer volume of attempts, positioning multiple snipers at a public event, accepting that some would be captured, but ensuring at least one successful shot, even proposing to use organized crime contacts to kidnap Castro during a foreign trip, then interrogating him before execution. None progressed beyond planning stages, blocked by operational impossibility or political unacceptability. The operations became increasingly desperate and poorly conceived as years passed without success. In 1965, an operative proposed using a rare tropical disease that could be introduced through mosquito bites, requiring only release of infected insects near Castro's residence. The Technical Services Division researched the concept, but concluded that controlling mosquito behavior was impossible, and the disease might spread beyond the intended target. Another operative suggested exploiting Castro's love of baseball by contaminating equipment at a field where he occasionally played informal games with advisors. The plan collapsed when security analysis revealed that Castro never used equipment he had not personally inspected. A particularly ambitious scheme involved recruiting a woman attractive enough to catch Castro's attention at a diplomatic reception, trained to inject poison during an intimate moment. The operation was abandoned when psychologists questioned whether anyone could maintain the necessary deception under such intimate circumstances. By 1966, the CIA had attempted to assassinate Fidel Castro over 600 times according to internal accounting, though the exact number depended on how attempts were counted. Some were fully operational missions that failed at the execution stage, like the poisoned cigars or the frozen milkshake capsule. Others were disrupted during planning, when security discovered the plot or operatives lost access to the target. Many were proposals that received approval and resources, but never reached operational status. Abandoned due to political changes, resource constraints, or practical impossibility, Cuban intelligence, aware of the assassination campaign, through their own sources and defectors from exile groups, began keeping their own count, eventually claiming that Castro had survived over 600 distinct assassination plots. The number became propaganda, used by Castro to portray himself as a survivor whom American imperialism could not defeat, blessed by revolutionary destiny and the people's protection. The Cuban government exploited the assassination attempts brilliantly for domestic and international propaganda. Castro spoke publicly about the plots, describing them in speeches that mixed fact with embellishment, portraying himself as a David resisting Goliath, a small nation's leader defying the world's most powerful empire. He displayed captured weapons and devices, including poison, pills provided by the CIA to captured operatives in museums dedicated to anti-imperialist resistance. He invited journalists to interview him about the attempts, giving detailed accounts that were sometimes accurate and sometimes exaggerated, but always politically effective. The narrative of American aggression and Cuban survival became central to the revolution's legitimacy, justifying Castro's authoritarian control as necessary to defend against existential threat. Every failed assassination attempt strengthened rather than weakened his position, proving to Cubans that their leader was special, protected, perhaps even invincible. The CIA's own analysts eventually concluded that the assassination campaign was counterproductive. Internal assessments in the late 1960s acknowledged that removing Castro would not necessarily end communist rule in Cuba, might create martyrdom that would strengthen rather than weaken the revolution, and risked catastrophic exposure if American involvement became publicly known. The Church Committee, a Senate investigation in 1975 that examined intelligence agency abuses, revealed details of the assassination plots, causing enormous political embarrassment and contributing to reforms limiting CIA operations. The committee heard testimony from CIA officers describing the poison pills, the mafia contracts, the exploding cigars, and the absurd failures. The revelations damaged America's moral standing internationally, provided propaganda victories to Soviet and Cuban intelligence, and led to new legal frameworks prohibiting assassination of foreign leaders. President Gerald Ford issued Executive Order 11905 in 1976, explicitly banning political assassination. No employee of the United States government shall engage in or conspire to engage in political assassination. The order formalized what had become unofficial policy. Assassination was no longer an acceptable tool of American foreign policy regardless of operational justification. Subsequent presidents maintained and strengthened the prohibition, though definitions of what constituted assassination versus legitimate military targeting remained contested, particularly after the September 11th attacks led to targeted killing of terrorist leaders. But for Castro specifically, the assassination campaign officially ended, replaced by embargo, diplomatic isolation, and hopes that the Cuban Revolution would collapse from internal contradictions rather than external violence. Castro himself seemed to enjoy his survival, incorporating it into his public persona. In speeches, he joked about the CIA's failures, suggesting they should hire more competent assassins or perhaps give up entirely. He claimed that his security detail had foiled plots the CIA never knew about, that he had personally identified poison in his food through some sixth sense developed through constant vigilance. Some of these claims were undoubtedly true. Cuban security was sophisticated, and Castro was genuinely careful. Others were likely embellished, but the embellishment served political purposes, reinforcing the narrative of American aggression and Cuban resilience. He gave interviews late in life, where he discussed specific assassination attempts with seeming amusement, describing the exploding cigar and poisoned wetsuit as evidence of American desperation and creative bankruptcy. The question of why so many attempts failed has no single answer, but rather a combination of factors that compounded across hundreds of operations. Castro's security was genuinely excellent, trained by Soviet and East German advisors who understood American intelligence methods and implemented comprehensive counter-surveillance and protection measures. Castro himself was unpredictable, changing schedules without notice, varying routines deliberately, and trusting his instincts when situations felt wrong. The CIA's insistence on deniability limited operational options, ruling out methods that would clearly indicate American involvement and forcing reliance on unreliable intermediaries like Cuban exiles and mafia contractors. Political oversight created bureaucratic delays, with operations requiring multiple approvals that gave security time to adapt. And perhaps most significantly, Castro was lucky, an intangible factor that intelligence analysts could not quantify, but which seemed to operate consistently across decades of attempts. The operational files reveal patterns of failure that suggest deeper problems beyond bad luck. Many operations relied on penetration of Castro's inner circle, recruiting people with access to kill him from within. But Castro's survival instinct and security apparatus made such penetration nearly impossible. Those who had genuine access were usually true believers in the revolution, unlikely to betray Castro for money or ideology. Those willing to betray Castro generally lacked sufficient access to act effectively. The few cases where the CIA found individuals with both access and willingness, like Kubela, the operation still failed because Castro's security included redundant protective layers that prevented any single individual from acting alone. The poisoned cigars failed because Castro did not smoke every cigar immediately, allowing time for toxin degradation or security discovery. The frozen milkshake capsule failed because the operative had not accounted for the physical environment where the poison was stored. Technical failures plagued operations repeatedly, suggesting that the Technical Services Division's laboratory conditions did not adequately replicate operational realities. Poison capsules that worked perfectly in controlled tests failed when frozen, heated, or subjected to humidity. Timing devices designed for specific conditions malfunctioned when deployed in tropical climate with unpredictable power supply. Weapons that were concealable and functional in demonstrations proved unreliable when operatives attempted to use them under stress. The gap between laboratory success and operational effectiveness created a pattern where plans looked viable during approval reviews, but collapsed during execution. This gap was not unique to anti-Castro operations. Intelligence history is filled with similar failures, but the sheer number of attempts against Castro made the pattern especially visible. The human element introduced unpredictability that planners consistently underestimated. Operatives who seemed committed during recruitment lost nerve at crucial moments, unable to kill another human being at close range regardless of training and motivation. Contacts who accepted money and equipment either disappeared, warned Castro's security, or simply froze when the moment came to act. The psychological burden of assassination, especially knowing failure meant torture and execution, proved too heavy for many operatives, regardless of how they presented themselves during recruitment. CIA officers, trained in intelligence operations, but not themselves killers, struggled to evaluate whether recruits possessed the psychological capacity to commit murder. The Mafia's involvement was partly an attempt to address this weakness, using professional criminals supposedly inured to violence. But even Mafia contractors proved unreliable when faced with Cuba's security environment. Political factors also undermined operations in ways planners could not control. Changes in presidential administrations altered priorities and resource allocation, with Kennedy intensely focused on Cuba, while Johnson was more interested in Vietnam. Congressional oversight, minimal in the early 1960s, but increasing after Vietnam and Watergate, created legal and political risks that made CIA leaders cautious about approving high-risk operations. International relations complicated matters, with European allies reluctant to allow their territory to be used for operations against Cuba, and Latin American nations sensitive to anything resembling American imperialism. The Soviet Union's protection of Cuba, implicit after the missile crisis and explicit through defense agreements, raised the stakes of any operation gone wrong, threatening to escalate into superpower confrontation. Castro exploited these weaknesses brilliantly, using intelligence about assassination plots to manipulate American policy and international opinion. Cuban intelligence penetrated exile groups in Miami, learning about CIA operations sometimes before they launched. This intelligence allowed Castro's security to preemptively disrupt operations, arrest operatives, and publicly expose American involvement in ways that maximized political damage. When the CIA tried to recruit a Cuban official, Castro's intelligence often already knew, sometimes turning the recruitment attempt into a double-agent operation that fed false information to the CIA while identifying American intelligence officers. The counterintelligence war was sophisticated on both sides, but Cuba, fighting defensively on home territory with a motivated population, had advantages that American intelligence could not overcome despite vastly superior resources. The psychological impact on CIA officers involved in the anti-Castro campaign was significant and lasting. Those who spent years planning operations that repeatedly failed experienced professional frustration and began questioning their own competence and their agency's capabilities. The cognitive dissonance of working with organized crime, violating the laws they were supposedly protecting, created moral ambiguity that troubled some officers. The eventual public exposure of the operations during church committee hearings and subsequent investigations brought personal and professional humiliation. Officers testified about schemes that sounded absurd in hindsight, defending decisions that seemed reasonable under Cold War pressure, but appeared foolish or criminal in calmer analysis. Some left the agency disillusioned. Others rationalized the operations as necessary responses to existential threat, but few emerged without psychological scars. The relationship between the CIA and organized crime during the anti-Castro campaign had consequences extending far beyond Cuba. Sam Giancana, one of the mafia bosses recruited for the assassination attempts, was murdered in 1975, shortly before he was scheduled to testify before the church committee about his CIA work. The killing, never solved, fueled speculation that either the mafia or intelligence agencies silenced him to prevent revelations. Johnny Rosselli, another mafia figure involved in the plots, was also murdered in 1976. His body found in an oil drum floating in Miami's Biscayne Bay. Santo Traficante survived, but faced constant questioning about what he knew and what he had done for the CIA. The murders and investigations created a permanent shadow over the relationship between intelligence and crime, raising questions about accountability and whether government agencies had used and then disposed of inconvenient partners. The technical innovations developed for anti-Castro operations influenced intelligence tradecraft for decades. The poison pen given to Kubela became a template for other concealed weapons, adapted for operations in different contexts. The research into undetectable poisons, though ethically troubling, produced knowledge that both American and foreign intelligence services exploited. The lessons learned about operational security in hostile environments, though learned through failure, informed training for subsequent generations of intelligence officers. The Technical Services Division itself evolved, becoming more rigorous about testing equipment under realistic conditions and more skeptical about operations that seemed technically feasible but operationally impractical. The failures against Castro, paradoxically, made American intelligence more effective in other contexts by teaching hard lessons about the gap between laboratory conditions and operational reality. Castro governed Cuba for 49 years after the assassination campaign officially ended, longer than almost any other 20th century leader. He survived not only CIA plots, but also economic embargo, the collapse of the Soviet Union, internal dissent, and international isolation. In 2006, illness forced him to transfer power to his brother Raul, and in 2008, he formally resigned as president, though he remained influential until his death in 2016 at age 90. His longevity became its own form of victory, outlasting 10 American presidents and multiple CIA directors, surviving long enough to see the United States begin normalizing relations with Cuba under President Obama. The fact that he died of natural causes, at an advanced age, in his own bed, represented the ultimate failure of the assassination campaign that had consumed so much American intelligence effort. The historical debate about the assassination attempts centers on whether they were ever strategically sound, regardless of operational outcome. Critics argue that killing Castro would not have ended communism in Cuba, might have triggered Soviet retaliation, and violated American values and international law. The failures, in this view, were fortunate, because success would have created worse problems, martyrdom strengthening the revolution and Soviet intervention possibly leading to nuclear confrontation. Defenders counter that eliminating Castro early, before Soviet commitment deepened, might have allowed a different Cuban trajectory, that the threat he represented justified extreme measures, and that operational failures, rather than strategic flaws, explained the campaign's lack of success. The debate remains unresolved, reflecting broader questions about intelligence operations, political assassination, and American foreign policy during the Cold War. The Cuban government's count of 600-plus assassination attempts includes many that the CIA would not categorize as serious operational efforts. Some were preliminary planning that never received final approval. Others were proposals from exile groups that the CIA considered but rejected. Still others were Cuban intelligence fabrications, either misinterpretations of legitimate contacts or deliberate exaggerations for propaganda purposes. The actual number of attempts that reached operational status with genuine chance of success was probably several dozen rather than hundreds, but the larger number, regardless of precision, captured an essential truth. American intelligence and its partners spent years obsessively pursuing Castro's death through an astonishing variety of methods, all of which failed. The scale of effort, the creativity of methods, and the consistency of failure together created a historical pattern unique in intelligence history. The cultural legacy of the anti-Castro assassination campaign extends beyond policy and intelligence, circles into popular imagination. The poisoned cigars, exploding seashells, and mafia hitmen became symbols of Cold War excess and the absurdities inherent in covert operations. Journalists and historians writing about the campaign struggled to maintain serious tone when describing schemes that seemed borrowed from cartoons. The contrast between the sophisticated resources deployed and the operational incompetence displayed became a subject of dark humor, with Castro himself joking that if the CIA wanted him dead, they should have just sent an intern with a pistol rather than engineering elaborate failures. The humor, though, could not completely obscure the serious moral and legal questions raised by a government deciding to assassinate a foreign leader and then failing so consistently that the failure itself became embarrassing. Intelligence professionals studying the anti-Castro campaign identified lessons applicable to contemporary operations. The importance of operational security when working with unreliable partners, demonstrated by how frequently exile groups were penetrated by Cuban intelligence. The limitations of technology when human elements introduce unpredictability, shown by sophisticated devices that failed because operatives froze or security procedures adapted. The political risks of operations that, if exposed, would create damage exceeding any plausible benefit, illustrated by the Church Committee revelations and resulting legal restrictions. And perhaps most fundamentally, the danger of allowing policy objectives to drive intelligence operations beyond the realm of feasibility, continuing efforts long after reasonable assessment suggested they could not succeed. Castro's own security measures, refined through decades of survival, became a model studied by protective services worldwide. The unpredictability of his schedule, making advanced planning nearly impossible for potential attackers. The layered security that prevented any single individual from having both access and opportunity to act alone. The food safety protocols that included random sourcing, multiple testing, and communal preparation that made targeted poisoning extremely difficult. The counterintelligence penetration of likely threat sources, identifying potential operatives before they could act. And the cultivation of public loyalty through political narrative that made assassination attempts strengthen rather than weaken his authority. Whether through skill, luck, or combination of both, Castro's survival demonstrated that even the world's most powerful intelligence agency could not eliminate a determined, careful, and fortunate adversary operating on home ground with a motivated security apparatus. The financial cost of the assassination campaign was enormous, though difficult to calculate precisely. Operation Mongoose alone, the broader destabilization effort that included assassination as one component, cost over $50 million annually in early 1960s dollars, equivalent to hundreds of millions today. The Miami station employed thousands of personnel, operated boats and aircraft, maintained safe houses and training facilities, and funded operations across the Caribbean. The Technical Services Division devoted significant resources to developing specialized weapons and poisons for anti-Castro operations. Payments to operatives, both CIA employees and contracted assets, accumulated over years of operations. The opportunity cost, intelligence resources devoted to Cuba rather than other priorities, was incalculable but substantial. For all this investment, Castro survived, raising questions about resource allocation and whether the same money and effort, applied differently, might have achieved better results. The moral questions raised by the assassination campaign remain controversial. International law generally prohibited political assassination even during the Cold War, though enforcement was minimal, and most nations engaged in such operations while denying them publicly. American values, theoretically opposed to political murder, were subordinated to perceived national security requirements, creating cognitive dissonance between ideals and actions. The partnership with organized crime introduced additional moral complexity, using criminals to accomplish what government employees could not or would not do, then protecting those criminals from prosecution. The civilian casualties and collateral damage from operations, though less than would have resulted from military invasion, still represented moral costs that planners acknowledged but accepted. Whether the threat Castro represented justified these moral compromises depends on judgments about Cold War stakes that historians continue debating. The impact on Cuban-American relations was profound and lasting. The assassination attempts, combined with the Bay of Pigs invasion, the economic embargo, and ongoing sabotage operations, created deep distrust that persisted for decades. Castro used American hostility to justify authoritarian control, arguing that a state of siege required limiting freedoms and maintaining security vigilance. Ordinary Cubans suffered from both the embargo and the security state, caught between American pressure and Castro's resistance. Cuban exiles in Miami, many of whom supported or participated in CIA operations, developed political influence in American elections that made normalizing relations politically difficult. The assassination campaign, intended to liberate Cuba from communist rule, instead contributed to entrenching exactly the regime it sought to eliminate. By the 1970s, the CIA had largely abandoned active assassination operations against Castro, though passive intelligence collection continued. Officers still recruited sources within the Cuban government, still monitored Castro's health and security arrangements, still maintained networks that could theoretically support operations if political leadership ordered them. But actual assassination attempts ceased, replaced by long-term strategies of isolation and embargo intended to collapse the Cuban economy and delegitimize the revolution. These strategies also failed to remove Castro, but at least they avoided the spectacular operational embarrassments that had characterized the earlier campaign. The shift represented lessons learned, acknowledgement that assassination was politically risky, operationally difficult, and strategically questionable, regardless of tactical success. Castro occasionally discussed the assassination attempts in interviews, sometimes seriously and sometimes with humor that suggested he enjoyed having survived. He claimed that Cuban intelligence had documented every attempt, maintained files on each operative involved, and understood American operations better than the CIA realized. Some of this was undoubtedly exaggeration, but Cuban intelligence was genuinely sophisticated and had achieved penetration of exile groups and perhaps CIA operations that American intelligence did not fully appreciate. Castro's survival stories became part of his personal mythology, the leader whom imperialism could not kill, protected by revolutionary righteousness and popular support. Whether he actually believed this mythology or simply found it politically useful was unclear, but he promoted it consistently. In 2006, when Fidel Castro underwent intestinal surgery and temporarily transferred power to Raúl, American intelligence agencies scrambled to assess whether his health crisis might achieve what assassination attempts had not. Analysts examined every piece of intelligence about his condition, trying to determine whether he would recover or whether Cuban leadership transition was finally occurring. The speculation proved premature. Castro recovered sufficiently to remain influential for another decade. But the episode illustrated that American interest in his mortality persisted long after active assassination operations ended. The CIA still hoping that natural causes would accomplish what hundreds of operations had failed to achieve. The families of operatives who died during anti-Castro operations, either executed after capture or killed during missions, received minimal recognition or compensation. Some operatives were CIA employees, whose deaths were acknowledged internally but never publicly. Their names eventually added to the memorial wall at CIA headquarters without details of how they died. Others were contracted assets, Cuban exiles or foreign nationals recruited for specific operations, whose deaths were not officially acknowledged at all. The moral responsibility for these deaths remained ambiguous. The individuals had volunteered knowing the risks, but they acted on behalf of policies set by officials who faced no personal danger. The disparity between risk and responsibility, common in intelligence operations, was especially stark in a campaign that failed so consistently while still demanding sacrifice from those ordered to execute impossible missions. Historical reassessment of the assassination campaign has evolved as documents were declassified and participants aged. Early accounts, based on limited information and Cold War assumptions, tended to portray the operations as reasonable responses to Soviet threat. Later scholarship, with access to CIA files and interviews with participants, revealed the operational incompetence and strategic questionability that characterized many attempts. The most recent analysis, incorporating Cuban intelligence documents and Castro's own accounts, presents a more complete picture. Sophisticated security apparatus, defeating often poorly planned operations, good fortune favoring Castro at crucial moments, and political constraints limiting American options, regardless of technical capabilities. The full story remains partially classified, some documents withheld for national security reasons or to protect sources, but enough is known to understand the campaign's scope and failure. The technical sophistication displayed in some operations contrasted sharply with the operational naivete in others, suggesting that the CIA's capabilities were uneven. The Technical Services Division could design poison delivery systems that were genuinely innovative, but operational planners could not always deploy them effectively. Intelligence collection could identify Castro's habits and vulnerabilities, but converting intelligence into successful operations proved consistently difficult. The agency's technical capabilities exceeded its human intelligence and operational expertise, creating a pattern where equipment worked but operations failed. This imbalance was not unique to anti-Castro operations. Intelligence history includes many examples of technical success and operational failure, but the pattern was especially visible in a campaign lasting years with consistent outcomes. Castro's revolution, which the assassination campaign aimed to eliminate, outlasted the Soviet Union that had supported it, survived economic collapse in the 1990s when Soviet subsidies ended, and persisted into the 21st century under Raúl Castro's leadership. The revolution's survival owed something to the American threat, which provided justification for sacrifice and unity, and something to genuine popular support, at least among significant portions of the Cuban population. Whether Cuba would have evolved differently without American hostility and assassination attempts is unknowable counterfactual, but the actual history suggests that external pressure strengthened rather than weakened Castro's control. The assassination campaign, intended to liberate Cuba, may have contributed to extending precisely the regime it sought to end. The lessons for contemporary intelligence operations are both obvious and ignored. Obvious because the anti-Castro campaign demonstrated clear operational principles. Assassination is difficult, unreliable, and politically risky. Working with criminal organizations creates uncontrollable complications. Technical sophistication does not guarantee operational success, and operations that continue despite repeated failure may reflect political pressure rather than strategic wisdom. Ignored because subsequent administrations and intelligence agencies have repeated similar patterns, pursuing regime change operations that fail for similar reasons. Working with unsavory partners who prove unreliable, and continuing operations beyond the point where reasonable assessment suggests they cannot succeed. The institutional memory of intelligence agencies, despite extensive documentation and analysis, seems insufficient to prevent cyclical repetition of past mistakes. The surviving participants in the anti-Castro assassination campaign, now elderly or deceased, left mixed accounts of their involvement. Some remained convinced the operations were necessary and properly executed, blaming bad luck and Castro's skill for failures. Others expressed regret about specific operations, particularly the Mafia partnership, and schemes that seemed ridiculous in retrospect. A few completely renounced their involvement, arguing the entire campaign was immoral and counterproductive, regardless of operational outcome. These divergent assessments reflect broader debates about intelligence ethics and the balance between national security imperatives and moral constraints. The personal reckonings of individuals involved, whether through official testimony, memoirs, or deathbed interviews, added human dimension to operations usually discussed in abstract policy terms. Castro's death in 2016 finally accomplished what 600 assassination attempts could not, removing him from power and ending an era of Cuban history. His death was announced by Raúl Castro in a brief television address that acknowledged Fidel's passing while emphasizing continuity of the revolution. Cuban Americans in Miami celebrated, gathering in the streets to mark the end of a leader they despised. In Cuba, reactions were mixed. Genuine grief from revolution supporters, quiet relief from those who had suffered under authoritarian control, and uncertainty about what would come next. American intelligence agencies monitored the transition carefully, assessing whether Fidel's death might create opportunities for political change. No such opportunities emerged immediately. Raúl maintained control and began limited economic reforms without fundamental political transformation. The fact that Castro died peacefully at 90, surrounded by family, represented a final irony in a relationship defined by failed American attempts to kill him. The CIA's most obsessive assassination campaign, consuming years of effort and enormous resources, ended with the target dying of natural causes after outlasting all the presidents and CIA directors who had authorized his elimination. The irony was not lost on observers who had followed the story for decades, Castro's survival becoming its own form of victory, regardless of Cuba's ongoing economic and political struggles. American power, demonstrated globally through military force and intelligence operations, proved unable to eliminate a single individual 90 miles from Florida, a limitation that said something profound about the nature of power and the unpredictability of human events. In the years following Castro's death, some CIA documents related to the assassination attempts were further declassified, providing additional details about operations previously known only through general descriptions. The documents confirmed many rumors, validated Castro's claims about certain attempts, and revealed operations that had remained completely unknown. They also showed the extent of political oversight, with presidents and attorneys general personally approving specific operations and demanding regular progress reports. The political involvement demonstrated that the assassination campaign was not rogue operations by overzealous intelligence officers, but rather official policy implemented through covert means. The responsibility reached to the highest levels of American government, even if subsequent presidents and officials preferred to characterize the operations as excessive actions by an insufficiently controlled intelligence agency. The question of whether the United States should have attempted to assassinate Castro remains contentious among historians, ethicists, and policy analysts. The case for assassination rested on arguments about Cold War necessity, the threat Castro posed to American interests, and the possibility that his early removal might have prevented decades of hostile Cuban-American relations. The case against emphasized moral principles, violation of international law, the questionable strategic value of assassination versus alternative policies, and the risk of normalizing political murder as a tool of statecraft. Neither argument is fully convincing because both require counterfactual assumptions about what would have happened if Castro had been successfully assassinated. Assumptions that cannot be tested against historical evidence. What is certain is that the campaign failed completely. That failure carried costs in resources, lives, and credibility, and that Castro used the attempts to strengthen rather than weaken his position. Whether better operational execution could have achieved success is unknowable. The closest attempt still failed for reasons that might recur in any replay. Whether success would have improved outcomes for Cuba, the United States, or the broader Cold War competition is equally unknowable. Assassination might have created worse problems than it solved. What can be evaluated is the decision-making process that authorized continued operations despite repeated failure. The bureaucratic and political dynamics that prevented honest assessment of whether the campaign made strategic sense, and the institutional cultures that prioritized action over effectiveness. The anti-Castro assassination campaign stands as a case study in the limits of intelligence operations and the dangers of allowing policy objectives to override operational reality. The CIA possessed technical capabilities, human resources, and political support that should theoretically have ensured success. Yet Castro survived. Not because assassination was impossible. Many leaders have been successfully assassinated, but because the specific combination of his security measures, operational environment, and perhaps luck created conditions where even sophisticated attempts consistently failed. The campaign's legacy includes legal restrictions on assassination, greater skepticism about covert operations, and a cautionary example studied by intelligence professionals, learning how institutional dynamics can perpetuate failing strategies. The final assessment of the anti-Castro assassination campaign must acknowledge both its spectacular failure and its significant consequences. It failed to kill Castro, failed to destabilize his regime, and failed to advance American interests in Cuba. It succeeded in creating scandal when exposed, providing propaganda victories to America's enemies, and demonstrating the limitations of intelligence operations divorced from realistic assessment of operational feasibility. The hundreds of attempts, ranging from sophisticated to absurd, expensive to cheap, carefully planned to hastily improvised, share only their common outcome and their contribution to a historical pattern that should inform future policy. Obsessive pursuit of an objective does not make that objective achievable, and persistence in failing strategies wastes resources while creating new problems. These lessons, obvious in retrospect, were apparently invisible to the officials and operatives who spent years pursuing Castro's death, with conviction that the next attempt would surely succeed where all previous ones had failed. The story ends not with the bang of successful assassination, but with the whimper of operations gradually abandoned. A campaign that faded from active execution to historical footnote, while its target survived to old age. Fidel Castro outlasted his enemies not through military superiority or political brilliance alone, but through survival itself, remaining alive long enough to transform from revolutionary threat into aging authoritarian, into historical figure, whose death, when it finally came, changed less than anyone expected. The CIA's 600 failed attempts became historical curiosity, evidence of American excess and the limits of power, a reminder that some objectives remain unachievable regardless of resources committed or determination displayed. In the end, Castro survived because survival was possible, and because every failed attempt taught his security apparatus lessons while teaching American intelligence very little. The hunter pursued endlessly, while the prey adapted, learned, and endured until the hunt simply ended, from exhaustion rather than success. Looking back across the decades of failed attempts, the most remarkable aspect is not any single operation's ingenuity or failure, but rather the sustained commitment to a strategy that never worked. Institutional momentum, political pressure, and psychological investment in prior decisions created a system where stopping seemed like admitting defeat, while continuing promised eventual vindication that never arrived. The officials who authorized attempts in 1961 were not the same individuals making decisions in 1965 or 1975. Yet the policy persisted across administrations and personnel changes, suggesting institutional dynamics beyond individual judgment. The CIA as an organization, the American government as a political system, and the Cold War as a strategic context all contributed to perpetuating operations that reasonable assessment should have abandoned much earlier. Understanding why the attempts continued, despite consistent failure, requires examining not just operational details, but the institutional and political forces that resist acknowledging when strategies fail.